Hey, Org-Commers, and welcome to another short lecture with Erik. This is the E-Dog himself barking at you. And for the next 10 to 20 minutes, we're going to be talking about gender at work. I'm just fooling around. That was a cool intro, though, right? So today we're going to talk about gender at work, and specifically we're going to talk about feminism. So, what is feminism, if you don't know? It's a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. And that definition comes from Bell Hooks, the famous writer and academic. So, as feminists, we're interested in how to understand, explain, and critique relationships between gender and power. Now, you know by this point in the course that everything that we analyze in terms of organizational communication, we look at in terms of flows of power. Who has it, who doesn't have it, and how is it used? This chapter is really no different. So, when we talk about feminism, oftentimes you'll hear people talking about feminism in terms of waves. And the idea behind this is that there were three sort of distinct modes of feminism that emerged at different points in history, and each were characterized by a different set of ideologies and goals. So first wave feminism, the first major push for feminism, begins during the mid-19th century and runs through the early 20th century. So that's from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s. And it was concerned primarily with women's suffrage or the right to vote. Second wave feminism, begins in the 1960s and is really concerned with broader issues, broader women's issues, including reproductive freedom. It's important to recognize that the birth control pill, first emerged during the 1960s, so there was a lot of focus on reproductive freedom. Domestic violence, rape, and the participation of women in socio-political domains that were previously exclusively for men, right? And then third wave feminism, which some people argue that we're still in the second wave, right? But others claim to be in the third wave. And they say that this began really in the 1980s and criticizes a lot of the thinking of the second wave of feminism for specifically privileging white middle-class women over women of color. All right, so it's really not until the 1990s that we begin to consider organizational communication from a feminist perspective. And so when we look at it here in these short lectures, we're going to consider each one of these perspectives as they're related to a particular wave. So we're going to look at the liberal feminist perspective, the radical feminist perspective, one of my favorites, and the critical feminist perspective. And each presents its own way of understanding gender in terms of patriarchy. And patriarchy is, if you don't know, is a fancy word for a social system in which men are in charge, right? So again, each looks at patriarchy in a different way in terms of gender and understanding it, domination, gender itself, notions of equality, and then finally emancipation or freedom. So, beginning with liberal feminism, we see this emerging during the 18th and 19th century as a liberal political theory. It's most commonly associated with the work of John Stuart Mill, who was a philosopher, and Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a writer and a feminist during this period of time. And the whole idea behind the liberal feminist movement is that it expands on many of the ideas that were created during the Enlightenment, right? So it's the Enlightenment traditions of liberty, fraternity, and equality that, in theory, the United States was founded on, right, or were founded on. And so this is much of the language in the Constitution comes directly out of Enlightenment traditions, right? And so they said, this is great, but the problem is we're only applying it to individual rights to men, right? So we need to extend this to women. And they really emphasized women's right to vote, right? Women's suffrage. So this was the big movement, and the major goal of liberal feminism during this period of time was to enable women to vote. And this sort of continues in some form or another, even as new forms of feminism emerged. So an example of this might be in the 1960s, a woman by the name of Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, which really gives voice to many of the frustrations that were felt at the time, particularly by well-educated middle-class women. And of course, this emphasis on the frustrations of well-educated middle-class women is one of the things that liberal feminism is now critiqued for, because it doesn't take into account all the other women in the world, right? So the principal concern with liberal feminism was really about expanding access to work and career opportunities for women. And emerging out of this, as a direct result of this, of course, we saw the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which made it illegal to discriminate based on sex, race, or religion, right? So this was, of course, viewed as a major accomplishment for liberal feminism. And the feminists really wanted women to be able to assume roles in existing institutions, right? So be able to go out and have careers that already existed, of course, in organizations like hospitals, healthcare, the law, academe, so that women could be professors. These are just a few examples, but the reality is that even at the time my mother was growing up during the 1950s, when she was a young woman, when she told me about her life, I asked her why she had become a teacher. My mother was a first grade teacher, and I asked her, Mom, why did you do this? And her response was, well, Erik, at the time, there were really only two career paths open to women, and those were teacher or nurse in terms of professional work. Now, of course, you could be a secretary as well, but arguably, you could say that secretarial positions were less autonomous than these other professions, like teaching, for example, and nursing. So liberal feminists were working towards getting women more career opportunities in the workplace, and despite great advances, right, we find that even today women are still vastly underrepresented in organizations. So, for example, your book tells you that in 2010, women comprise only 14% of executives in Fortune 500 companies. So 86% are men and only 14% are women. And so this relates to a notion and a phrase you've probably heard before, which is the glass ceiling. And the idea here is that the glass ceiling represents a barrier which is not really visible, it's not formal, it's not legislative, it's not a barrier that exists because of law or because of corporate policies. Rather, it's sort of this invisible barrier which women hit in their careers, where they feel like they can't go further, and it's because of sexism, right, oftentimes. And so, of course, feminists, excuse me, are trying to shatter this glass ceiling. And if you'll recall, during the 2016 election, after Hillary Clinton had of course planned on winning and had was going to have her post-election celebration party, victory party, in a room that had a literal glass ceiling, and the idea was, of course, that she was shattering that glass ceiling by becoming the first female president, which unfortunately didn't happen, or fortunately, I guess, depending on your politics. So, interestingly, of course, this philosophy leads to various studies of corporations, and one of the more famous one was this book by Cantor, Men and Women of the Corporation. And this was a 5-year-long study, right, of women's roles in a large organization. And within the context of this study, Cantor finds two things, right? There are two sort of social phenomena that she takes note of. One is what we call tokenism, and the other is homosocial reproduction. So tokenism, you probably heard this term before. Oh, she's the token woman, right? So the word tokenism refers to a condition in which a person finds him or herself identified as a minority in a dominant culture. So if it's all men and there's one woman on the board of directors, people might say she's the token woman, right? So token, and that of course is oftentimes used as a pejorative term or a derogatory term. What Cantor found with regard to tokenism is that tokens are easily visible and come to be viewed as representatives of their minority group rather than as individuals. So, in a situation where, let's say, you're the only woman on a board of directors, you act. The idea is that people view you. You don't act, but people view you as representative of all women instead of just being a woman. Also, people in this position often have to work harder to achieve the same rewards other people in the organization achieve. And any failure on the part of the person who's been, ascribed this label of token is attributed to the entire minority group rather than the individual. So if there's only one woman on the board and she does something wrong, then the reaction is, oh, well, what do you expect? She's a woman, right? Instead of just saying, well, Sally failed at that. And of course, this is unfair, right? And so tokenism is a perceptual phenomenon that then is created by the members of the dominant culture. So there's if there's a whole bunch of guys sitting in the boardroom, it's those guys that are creating this situation of tokenism, and who perpetuate it, who make it possible. Now, homosocial reproduction is the other thing that Rosabeth Cantor observed. And so homosocial reproduction is pretty simple. It's the idea that the men who manage reproduce themselves in kind. So to explain this relatively simple thing, guys in charge like to hire other guys so that they can later be in charge as well, right? Male managers like to work with people like themselves. And so what this creates then, and what, one of the symptoms of this is what we call the old boys network, right? Where you have a bunch of older white guys who all, went to Ivy League schools, who hire more young men who went to Ivy League schools to remind them of themselves when they were younger, right? Who grow up to be a group of old men, right? And you get the idea. They just hire people who look and act like them and who share many of the same socioeconomic characteristics. And this can create a network, right? This can create a network of old men in charge, right? And of course, it's really hard for anyone who's not part of that particular demographic or that particular group to break into it and to actually achieve what they've earned, right? In many instances, achieve the recognition that they've earned. All right, so that's it for this first short lecture. And next time we'll talk more about the different waves or types of feminism. Thanks for checking this out.